I'm online. But good. Going back to Liberty City after a while in Los Santos. Setting up an audio to play in the background from C-SPAN. I wouldn't imagine that a lot of people are into C-SPAN, but I think it's pretty cool. Something I've never heard about before.
I come here tonight to the Al Smith dinner knowing that I'm the underdog in these final weeks, but if you know where to look,
Texas
there are
right
signs
here.
of hope. There are signs of hope, even in the most unexpected places, even in this room full of proud Manhattan Democrats. I can't shake that feeling that some people here are pulling for me. I'm delighted to see you here tonight, Hillary.
I was thrilled to get this invitation, and I feel right at home here because it's often been said that I share the politics of Alfred E. Smith and the ears of Alfred E. Newman. It is an honor to be here with Al Smith. I obviously never knew your great-grandfather, but from everything that Senator McCain has told me, the two of them had a great time together before Prohibition. So,
Of course, I am delighted, but not surprised by the final repeal of the 18th Amendment. I felt all along that when this matter was properly submitted to the rank and file of our people, they would readily see that it had no place in our Constitution. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to estimate the benefit that will come to this country from the lesson taught to the coming generation to make it their business to see that no such matter as this is ever again made the subject of federal constitutional law.
And you've been listening to the 2008 presidential nominees talking at that year's annual Al Smith dinner, followed by Al Smith himself talking about the lifting of Prohibition in 1933. Hello, and welcome to C-SPAN's The Contender Series. We come to you live tonight from the New York State Assembly Chamber in Albany, New York, where contender Al Smith served for 12 years before being elected governor and becoming the Democratic nominee for president in 1928. Our guest for the next 2 hours as we relive the 1928 presidential election and the life and career of Al Smith, John Evers. He is the former historian for the New York State Assembly, and he is a PhD candidate at SUNY Albany and he's doing his dissertation on Al Smith. And we're also joined by Beverly Gage of Yale University. She's also the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded. She is a history professor there. Professor Gage, if you could set the scene for us to begin. 1928, the United States. What was going on in this country? What were some of the issues that were going to be discussed in the 1928 election?
But the 1928 election is one of the most interesting and also one of the most vicious elections in American history. We have two candidates who I think really embody two different sorts of Americas that are coming into conflict in the election. So we have Al Smith, who's the subject tonight.
Back to
Al
Liberty
Smith
City,
is
then.
urban. He's from New York City. He's an Irishman. He is
just said New York
Catholic,
City.
and he represents a kind of immigrant urban America that has come of age in the last
that was
30
the only
years.
other person
On the
in
other
the
side,
game.
as a Republican candidate in
Now it's
1928, we have
just
Herbert
me.
Hoover, who
There's still
in many
one
ways could
person at
hardly
the
be more
airport
different
over
from
there.
Al Smith. He is from the Midwest. He's from Iowa. He is very straight-laced. He is distinctly non-urban.
Well, so
he
much
is
to do
pious.
in
He
Liberty
wears very
City.
starchy colors.
That
And these two men in 1928, as they go up for the presidential election, really encapsulate some of the most important cultural and political clashes
thought
of that
that
moment,
was
clashes over
that right
prohibition,
there.
to some
That
degree clashes over the economy.
place.
But in many ways, this turns out to be really a cultural election
Oh,
that
that's
hinges
that,
on which
the
of these
thing
two
that looks like
Americas
from Men in
is the
Black,
America that's
that,
going to be voted into office.
Well, it's been said that the three Ps
I don't
influenced
know.
this
Oh, do
election
some
in
freeway
1928.
stuff
Prohibition,
here.
prejudice, and prosperity.
Right, I think the three Ps really do capture it. So on Prohibition, we have Al Smith, who is one of the nation's most outspoken opponents
The
of Prohibition.
Bay
Prohibition
Bar.
has been in effect by
I didn't know that
1928
that
for
was a
almost a
thing.
decade. And it has been a real problem for most of that time. And throughout, Al Smith,
assault
like
rifle.
many urban politicians, has said that it's a bad idea, not only because it infringes on
Apparently
Americans' freedom,
modeled on the
but because
AK-47.
it's causing a law enforcement crisis. And there are many people who are quite concerned about this by 1928. So what's going to happen to Prohibition is certainly one of the big questions. We have Herbert Hoover on the other side. In terms of prosperity, as you might imagine, both of them are running in favor of prosperity. The problem for Al Smith is that you've had 8 years of Republican rule in the presidency by that point, first Warren Harding, and then followed by Calvin Coolidge. And so the Republicans sort of have a leg up on the prosperity front. You've had the 1920s, it's been a boom decade, certainly for Wall Street, for large segments of the economy, although less for farmers and agriculture at that point. So that's our second P. And I think the darkest part of this election, and the reason that I said it
The
really is one
Bar
of the most
Babes,
vicious elections in
like
American
the Bay
history,
Bridge.
is our third P, is the question of prejudice.
The Ridge
And
of
Al
Babes.
Smith, I think most Americans today are probably more familiar with John Kennedy as a Catholic candidate, and even in 1960, that causing a real stir, a real set of questions about the presidency. But Al Smith
She's a
raised all of those
lady.
questions much earlier in
Whoa,
1928, which already
whoa,
had been a decade
she's a
that had been seized with a
lady.
lot of questions about immigration,
I didn't know
immigration
there was a
reform, the rise
gumball
of the Ku Klux
machine.
Klan, and those come into play in his candidacy.
John Evers, the role of Catholicism in the 1928 election, how did it play out?
Well, it was a vicious campaign, and Smith was not official convention as a political whispering campaign. Smith went into this a full year, 4 years or so in advance of the election, knowing that this would be an issue. In fact, he addressed this issue in 1927 in his reply to the Atlantic Monthly, discussing why a Catholic man should be president, which was a very good statement, although it was an election. Right over everybody's heads, and it didn't help his campaign.
As I mentioned earlier, we are in the New York State Assembly Chamber in Albany, New York, in the New York State Capitol building, finished in 1894. We also are pleased to have join us a studio audience of Albany area residents, college students, historians interested in Al Smith folks here, and they'll also have a chance to ask questions about Al Smith in the 1928 election, as will you. We're going to put the phone numbers up on the screen. I'm not going to take phone calls for a little while, but we're going to put them up on the screen so you can start to dial in now. This is the 14-week series of contenders. The focus, 1928 election and Al Smith. 202 is area code.
Oh, there's that jump in the
Eastern Central Time Zones. 202-737-002 if you live in the Mountain or Pacific Time Zones. John Evers, what kind of a candidate was Al Smith in 1928?
He was a fighter. I mean, if you look at him and you see the short stature and the pugnaciousness of him, his gravelly voice, of course, comes out across America. This is one of the first campaigns where radio plays a role. He campaigns from the back of trains, which is very common. But he goes out there and he tries to engage America on issues that are important to America. But he came out as a fighter, and his speeches were well reasoned. On paper, he was a fantastic candidate, but he just was swimming uphill the whole time.
Beverly Gage, electoral vote count.
Now I know.
Al Smith, what states did he
I'm gonna
win?
go to,
Right. Well, it was definitely a election.
that is civilian car.
In some ways, we can almost say so. Al Smith, maybe he should thank his lucky stars because he did not, in fact, win the 1928 election. And that Herbert Hoover, we might remember Al Smith's name a little more, but what would we remember him for? So yeah, it was really one of these blowout elections, and I think it was really heartbreaking for Smith and for Smith's supporters, in part because it had been such a nasty campaign. And one of the big questions of the election ultimately became, was it prosperity? He took that to heart. He was very concerned about that and the real nastiness of that campaign. So he had some support from
There's a fourth thing I want to talk about, and that's progressivism. Al Smith was known as a progressive during his time in the legislature as governor.
That's a one tall building.
How progressive politics identified back in the 70s.
Right. Well,
Radical
progressivism, when you think about it as a historical phenomenon, I always sort of think about it as a turn-of-the-century phenomenon. Really begins around 1900. St. Teddy Roosevelt was our pioneer progressive. And what it means by the 1920s is very hard to find in many ways. There were people who called themselves progressives who supported prohibition and who were very passionate about it. There were people who called themselves progressives who opposed prohibition, like Al Smith, and who were also very passionate about it. But the basic idea of progressivism was a sense that had come about and that Al Smith really did stand for, that you could use government in new and sort of proactive ways to deal with some of the really pressing social and industrial conditions that Americans faced back in the 20th century. And Al Smith, as governor and then running as candidate for president, really tried to make that case. I mean, he changes his mind a little bit later when the New Deal comes along, and we'll get to that probably. But so that was really the basic idea of progressivism, was the idea that you could use federal power.
President, he had experimented with all these things in New York State. He was a champion of the labor issue. He was a champion of hydroelectric power. He was a champion of parks and recreation. He was one that wanted to spend money for the social programs in New York State. And they were
there's that guy.
But when he ran in 1928, people didn't want to hear that issue. I mean, it was overclouded by prosperity.
Are there
So
two
it was
of
a
them in
campaign
this
about his religion.
car?
It was this unknown politician that had this thick New York accent that came out to the farm country. Even Smith, when he campaigned, in fact, he had one funny story. He was driving on the train through Wyoming, and they were about an hour out, and he sees a horse out in the field, and he says to somebody, "Oh, must
I
be getting
think
close
the
to
guy
civilization. There's a horse here."
got up
And the guy
and
said, "No,
he
that's a
was
wild
running
horse. We got
away.
about an hour to go." And it showed just how much Smith was out of his element, and he said, "Oh, okay, he really was used to New York."
For consideration on the national stage.
Oh, absolutely. Al Smith was nominated, and it was always the favorite son candidacies. But when the first balloting happened in 1920, they nominated Al Smith for governor, for
What is
president,
that
and in
light?
1920, and it went one round, and of course they dropped the votes, and they go, eventually it was the Cox from Ohio. In 1924, they really went out for Smith. It was in New York City, and it was 103 ballots. Eventually he has to withdraw. They had a compromise candidate who was also a New Yorker. In 1928, of course, he wins the nomination. But all through history, the New York governor, this is even in modern history, the New York governor is automatically considered presidential material. And if you look at the people that have run and won, and those that have run and lost, you'll see New
But
Yorkers
just
all
turn
through
off
history.
the headlights.
I was just going to jump in there. Yeah, and I think that it's New York was incredibly important. So there were really two key political states at that moment. New York was one of them. Ohio was the other one. They just kept producing president after president. I don't think we really have states quite like that anymore. Maybe we could look to something like Texas. But it's also not just in the Democratic Party. I mean, you see when you look at the Republican Party, you see Teddy Roosevelt, you see Charles Evans Hughes, all of these figures coming out of New York politics. And when you look at the Democratic Party, you see Al Smith, you see Franklin Roosevelt. And so New York as a state has two machines really going, and it has a pretty significant national effect.
Two machines?
Well, of course, the famous machine is really the Tammany machine, but the Republicans have an incredibly powerful network as well.
Need some help.
So Tammany Hall is technically just
the burger shot.
New York City Democratic Party, so the Manhattan Democratic Party. But Tammany Hall from the mid-19th century was best known as the machine of machines in urban America. So it was identified as a primarily Irish machine, a machine in New York that really depended on neighborhood power, ward word power, and that was as much about sort of taking care of your neighborhood and coming up through the neighborhood as it was anything really about national politics. But Tammany, absolutely the most powerful force, certainly in New York City politics at that moment, but really in New York State Democratic politics.
John Evers, how did Tammany Hall fit into the 1928?
Well, that was the brush that painted Democratic candidate and Republican candidate from New York State. Like Teddy Roosevelt ran in 1904 against Alton Brooks Parker, the chief judge of the Court of Appeals in New York State. One was a Republican, one was a Democrat. But Tammany Hall was always seen outside of New York State, and sometimes in New York State, as the corrupt machine. It was seen as Boss Tweed. People like William Jennings Bryan would rant and rave about Tammany, but he wanted their votes. But he just didn't want to have a Tammany man there. They didn't want them pulling the strings. Eventually, Smith is the Tammany man and the candidate, and it shocked many of the people within the Democratic Party.
Al Smith lost New York in the 1928 election.
He did. He had the sad fate of losing the race for President of the United States and seeing his handpicked successor win. And as we've already discussed, for governor, FDR wins, and it flips the dynamic of Smith-Roosevelt's relationship forever. And ultimately, Roosevelt winds up where Smith wanted to be, and Smith winds up in retirement.
And we will get into that. Beverly Gage, when we asked you prior to the show some of the issues that you thought were important to the 1928 election, one that you mentioned was the role of the media in 1928. Why?
Well, I think particularly for Al Smith, he had sort of come of age as a media battler, and particularly including Roundup First, which is after him and after one of the most powerful newspaper tycoons in the country. And so Smith, I think, had a certain amount of confidence by 1928 that he knew how to fend off these kinds of press attacks. But ultimately, in the election, one of the interesting things about the Catholic issue is that we now understand it to have been absolutely crucial to this election. I mean, Smith openly acknowledged it, but a lot of it was done and talked about through innuendo. John mentioned earlier the idea of a whispering campaign, right? That it wasn't something that was going to be said in the press, but at the same time, the press was going to kind of feed into these images. And so I think Smith, from my reading of it anyway, was sort of behind from the first with the press, in part because there was the respect he might have deserved.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about Smith and the press is he loved the press. I mean, he used to hold press conferences here at Albany. The press corps got to be very close to him. He had a great relationship with what's on the record, what's off the record. Except for the battles rehearsed and his newspapers in New York State. He really enjoyed that. When he left the safe confines of New York State and this whispering campaign came out and there was papers that weren't friendly to him and wouldn't cover the issues that were important in the campaign, Smith was greatly hurt by that. He wasn't used to that. And he also wasn't used to the media of the day. The pie plate, he used to call the microphone that you'd speak into right from the hospital where he accepted the nomination for President of the United States, right in this very room. He would speak into the microphone. He didn't like to read prepared speeches. Smith used to write. He'd take out of his coat pocket an envelope, and he wrote everything on the backs of envelopes. Long after Lincoln, I guess, he used to have that custom of saying, well, these are the points I'm going to make, and I'm going to address the nation on these things, and I'm going to speak from the heart. When the campaign started to be more the prepared speech, he wasn't used to that. He was used to getting down and doing the campaign, meeting people, reading people, and going out there amongst them.
Fine is
Just
2
to jump in,
plus
I mean,
points.
you also mentioned the rise of radio, and I think that made a huge difference in how Americans were able to perceive Smith, because he's this New York guy. I will not attempt to do. Do you want to attempt to do an Al Smith impersonation?
No.
I don't want to. He had this thick New York accent, and the fact that people could not only read about him but could actually hear him, and in many ways to broad swaths of Americans, he sounded foreign, right? He didn't sound like he came from another country, but he sounded different from them, and that became another big issue in the campaign.
So this was the first time ever that people were able to hear in mass media their candidates, correct?
Oh, yeah, they had, there was always, as radio started to get bigger, and as radio, or hospital is horspital, people would say, is this guy an American? And that added to that whispering campaign.
Again, we are live from the New York State Assembly Chamber in Albany, New York. The contenders, Al Smith. This is our 6th week, and we're looking at Al Smith, 4-time governor of New York, 1928 presidential nominee for the Democrats. 202 is the area code, 737-0001 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-737-0002 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, throughout this 2 hours that we'll be talking about Al Smith, we'll return to the 1928 election as often as our callers, our questioners want to. But we want to learn a little bit about what and
Glasses?
where Al Smith came from. Here's a little bit of Al Smith talking about
They have glasses?
I was born down in 174 South Street, in a little house right under the Brooklyn Bridge. You know, the bridge was erected when I was a small boy.
Welcome to Clucking Bell, motherfucker!
I just witnessed a great spectacle, but at the same time, a very bitter disappointment. Why, what did he mean? Well, here's the story as he told it to me. He said, son, the bridge has kept thousands of men working for years.
Veggie wings?
The concrete, the wiring, the machinery, cost millions of dollars. Today was the opening. Bands were playing. Flags were waving. They cut the tape, and finally, it happened. What happened? Why, they found out that all you could do was go to Brooklyn.
This is the neighborhood where Al Smith grew up. He was born down on South Street.
Looks like actual food.
Fulton Fish Market in the South Street Seaport. He raised his children here. He went to school in the same parish here, right around the block, to St. James, till 8th grade, till his father died, and he had to go off to work and support his mother and his sister. But this was Al Smith. This was the Lower East Side. This is where his accent came from. And
It's like
this is
popcorn,
where
chicken, and
it all began
fries.
for him. It was all Irish Italian. You know, they came
Salads.
over there from
Look at that.
Ellis Island, and they settled in here. And he got involved with Tammany Hall. He through this neighborhood and kind of grew from there.
So a coffee machine and coffee
And that second
cups
speaker here,
underneath.
of course, was Al Smith IV,
Coffee
Al Smith's
in the
great-grandson.
fridge.
But John Evers,
Cups
what
and
is
lids
the
on
Lower
it?
East Side and its importance in Al Smith's career?
The first thing is, I never know vocal cords could be inherited. I mean, that sounded a little like his great-grandfather. The
I
Lower
wonder
East
if
Side
there's
is
anything
the
here. I
southern
don't
tip of
think so. I
Manhattan,
didn't
and that's
think
where
so.
Smith was from. A little on the southeast
Employee
side.
hand wash.
It was a port. It was not like it is
Clean
today.
hands.
But Smith used to claim that he didn't know this, and he probably didn't know this. But he grew up in this bustling area, and the center of his neighborhood was a Catholic church, where he went to St. James. He was an altar boy. He used to work, sell papers. The sad part about Smith's early life, and this shaped him forever, was that he lost his father very young. He was about 12. His father was a trucking man, teamster, and he would cart goods from the seaport up through the city. He died young and forced Smith to leave school. He never graduated even from the 8th grade. In fact, if you trace his Red Book entries, which is the official biographies of the New York State Assemblyman, he always said that he graduated from 8th grade, which wasn't true, and that he inherited his father's truck business, which also wasn't true. But that might have been a little bit of self-consciousness of sitting in a chamber filled with lawyers and doctors and assemblymen from wealthy backgrounds from upstate. But this real struggling, die-hard neighborhood shaped him forever, and it made him tough. He enjoyed it, and for the rest of his life, it was a Catholic church, it was a family, and it was a Democratic Party.
So he went through 7th grade.
He had to leave about a month or two prior to graduating 8th grade because things were just too tough at home.
Beverly Gage, 1873.
Oh, come on.
Lower East Side of New York. Again, paint the larger picture. What was New York like? What was the country like?
Sort of the dominant political fact of recent history. In New York, really, though, you're beginning to see the city change in all sorts of interesting ways. In the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, you had this first massive wave of immigration, and that had been mostly from places like Ireland, from places like Germany, and Irish and German immigrants had settled the city. By the time you're getting into the 1870s, 80s, 90s, in particular, you're beginning to get waves of immigration from new areas like Russia, Eastern Europe. And so New York is really becoming, the way that we think about it, as a kind of polyglot city. This is really the age in which that's beginning to really congeal and become an important part of the city's politics. As part of this, all of these groups are beginning to organize, and as we said, this is sort of the heyday of Tammany Hall, of the Irish machine really getting its bearings in New York in the middle of the 19th century. What were conditions like? The Lower East Side is famous during these years, particularly as you get into the late 19th century, as being the single most crowded place on the face of the earth. And there's not much tenement regulation at that point. There are not much by way of sanitary regulations. I mean, it's kind of a free-for-all. So you're enormously crowded conditions. Often you have big problems with disease on the Lower East Side. The sanitary conditions are poor. But in many people's memories, you also have very tight-knit ethnic neighborhoods, which had some powerful institutions, sometimes churches, later for other groups, sometimes synagogues, sometimes labor unions, beginning to emerge during these years. So the Lower East Side at that moment is this tightly packed, very intense place in New York. And for a lot of the country, it's a symbol of, for many people, the urban ills that are beginning to really press upon the country. Overcrowding, industrial strife, poor working conditions, disease, and for many people, and this continues through to the 1920s, immigration itself being a symbol of a way that the country's changing.
And I think that in Smith's day it was the same. He would talk about the sailors from the different countries. He would meet people from all over the world, literally. And there was sections of his area where he lived. There was Russians, there were Jews, there were people from Italy, there were people from Chinatown, which is up the road. And he lived in this little enclave that was surrounded by all this. He could go over a few blocks and there'd be areas of ice. He could go just a block down the street and there would be ships from all over the world. And this shaped his image. He thought he was this. In fact, when he first went to the assembly and started traveling the state, he realized, I've seen a lot more just in my neighborhood than what these people have seen. But he couldn't bring everybody down to New York to Manhattan. Many members of the assembly say this is how America really is. It's this polyglot. This is a melting pot. And that caused a lot of problems. Some of that came back to xenophobia. Some of it came back to anti-religion, to his accent. It was almost a kind of way for them to say, you're foreign, you're not like us.
He went to work in about 1886 at 13 years old.
He had probably one of the toughest careers that I've ever heard of. He starts by leaving early, and he goes and sells newspapers. He goes to start, after school, I'm going to sell newspapers. He makes a few dollars that way. It's not enough. His mother, incidentally, had to go and get a job the day that they married, selling papers. It's not enough. Eventually, he goes through a rapid series of jobs, working in a small candy store that his mother was a proprietor of. He then goes and works in a company that is a truck spotting. He used to run around the south end, lower Manhattan, and pick up the different trucks for his company and report that don't come back, go to this spot. So he was a truck spotter. Eventually, he gets the most famous job. He's well known for his Fulton Fish Market. And as a young man who's a teenager, getting up at 4 in the morning, rolling barrels, shoveling crushed ice, coming home smelling like fish, and he didn't get home. He'd go there at 4, and he'd get back at 4 in the afternoon. Well, this led him into eventually getting a job at Tammany Hall, where he wasn't getting up at 4 smelling like fish. The good thing about it was he got to take home all the fish he wanted, which he used to joke about and say, if you could pile all the fish up that him and his family ate, it would rip the rafters off the Capitol and slide down State Street Hill 15 feet deep, because that was how poor he was, and Fulton Fish Market gave him a lot of free food.
This is The Contenders. We're talking about Al Smith, the 1928 presidential election. And first up for our two guests is East Greenbush, New York.
Al Smith's role in commitment was to both the New York State civil service system and labor, and how he championed that campaign.
Drove all night just to find entrance to
Help reform
entrance to the entrance to the New York.
system and his commitment to labor, what he did for labor movement in New York State and later on the federal campaign.
Thank you. Thank you, Wade.
John, that's a really good point that always separated Al Smith when it came to labor issues. Is in 1911 there was the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Factory fire down in Manhattan, and Smith was on the commission that was passed by the legislature to study labor law. And Smith drew closer. He became good friends with Francis Perkins, Rose Schneiderman, all the reforming labor advocates at the time. It passed in this very chamber the labor laws which would regulate fire escapes, hours of service, health codes, workmen's compensation, and hand in hand with that probably was the advent of civil service. Now, he wanted to pack everything with Democrats, but he used to say, and this became more prevalent as he got towards the end of his political career, is that the most qualified person who should have a job. And Smith was well known to have people in his cabinet that were Republicans, that were not enrolled, people that had nothing to do with government at all. In fact, his highway commissioner was a military engineer who had, I believe, Republican affiliations. So Smith wanted the most qualified people around him, and some of that bled over into the civil service. So he wanted to have good civil service, and he also wanted to have strong labor relations. He stood up for those when it came to labor that were often shunted aside, and the reactionary forces often embodied the Republican Party fought him on this. He took that nationally when he campaigned and had the support of the AFL-CIO from New York State in 1928, although the national AFL, I should say, was the AFL-CIO until 35. The AFL championed him state, but not nationally in his 1928 campaign.
So the regulation issues that John Evers was just talking about, did they play out nationally, and how strong were the forces behind those issues?
They did. Well, I think Al's also a good example of someone who was sort of radicalized over the course of his time as a politician. He really starts out as an unexceptional mechanic guy. He's not putting forth particularly creative ideas, from what anyone can tell. We don't know that much about what he was doing when he was an early assemblyman, but both through the kind of social teenage girls, mostly teenage immigrant girls, who are locked in on the 8th and 9th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Building. They're forced to jump to their deaths, and so he ends up on this commission. And he becomes sort of a true progressive in both what I would say is the sort of radical and not radical sense of that word. When he begins to work on the commission, they revamp fire codes, they pass legislation to protect women and children, and so he becomes an advocate of kind of paternalistic labor laws and of revamping building codes. He's never a super strong supporter of kind of grassroots organizing from its base, and one of the things that's often left out of the Triangle story is the fact that there have been strikes underway at that factory and throughout the shirtwaist industry, and that doesn't really become something that he champions in quite the same way that he does champion legislation that's going to ameliorate industrial conditions, and that's very much his stance by the time that he's running for president in the 1920s. And the 1920s are not a good decade for American labor, and so it's not one of the big issues of the campaign, but nonetheless he holds on to this progressive tradition. And one other thing that's worth noting as well, I actually first encountered Al Smith when I was doing some research on a bombing that happened in New York in 1920, which was this attack on Wall Street at the time. But I encountered Al Smith because he had just become governor, and this was in the midst of the Red Scare after the First World War, and 5 socialist assemblymen who had been seated and voted in from districts in New York and had been seated in the New York Assembly were thrown out. And Al's voices that was really speaking out in favor of a very broad vision of democracy and of political opinion at that point.
John Evers, knowing what you do about Al Smith, how do you think you feel about the current Occupy Wall Street movement down in New York?
That'd be interesting. Smith always championed, and it just was the underdog, because he was an underdog. When Smith, and we talked about the socialists, Smith went out there and took unpopular stances. I mean, he got up there in 1920 and told the Speaker of the Assembly the next day, I'm going to put out a press release championing the right of these people to hold their seats. And it was flabbergasted. No one would do that. I mean, we're in the middle of a Red Scare. These people are anarchists. The same with labor. Smith would go and he'd settle labor strikes when he was governor by sending not only state employees from the labor department, but in one case, Francis Perkins, a woman who had to settle an upstate labor dispute. They'd say, he's not only sending government people, he's sending women now. I mean, he was unconventional when it came to that. And it was an entering wedge into more diversity when it came to New York State government. When it comes to something like that, I think Smith would probably look at it and say, what is it for the best of the good of the people? He was not, in his early days, a big champion of big business.
Francis in Cincinnati, thanks for holding your On the Contenders on C-SPAN. Please go ahead.
I have been privileged to have gone to school in Albany, and I'd like to know if you could address the financial backing that Al Smith had by John J. Raskob and the contention that there was because Smith was Catholic and trying to become president. Thank you very much.
Francis, where did you go to school here in Albany? We've got several colleges represented in our audience this evening in the Assembly.
I went to the Academy of the Sacred Heart on South Pearl Street, which unfortunately has been closed and is now for sale.
Okay, Francis, thank you very much. The financial question.
As I mentioned early in his career, Smith was not a huge champion of business. He voted as he was told to vote. He later on drifted more towards pro-business, and that was after the Roosevelt fallout and the American Deliberative League. But Raskob was a multimillionaire, and he wanted to be involved in politics, and he got to be friends with Al Smith, and Smith makes him the head of his campaign in 1928. Much to the consternation of many people around him who said, this guy's not a politician, he's not active in Democratic politics, why are you doing this? A lot of people thought it's because of the money. And later in life, Smith also became good friends with many people. Bill Kenny was one, Morgan was another. These New York Irishmen who made a lot of money and became millionaires, they gave Smith jobs. I mean, they made him head of the Empire State Building Corporation. So Smith did drift towards more money later on, but Raskob at that time was kind of a hard bet. Smith wanted him as a friend, and of course he wanted a lot of money.
Right, I think it's true. I mean, the question that came up about what we think about Occupy Wall Street, it really depends which Al Smith we're talking about. And, Al Smith, there's Al Smith as a young man who's really, as I said, just a kind of straightforward Tammany politician. He's voting as Tammany tells him to vote. He's coming up through the ranks. There are no rivers of greatness during those years. But then he becomes this sort of progressive politician, both as governor of New York and then when he's running for president in 1928 and throughout the 1920s. After that, he takes a turn in which he becomes hostile, actually, not only to the New Deal, but takes up some of the kind of red-baiting tactics that he himself had fought so hard against. So, in terms of trying to judge, how is Smith going to respond to the social movements of his day, some of which were deeply anti-Wall Street, it kind of depends on when you run into him. So, if you got him at the right moment, he would have been, I think, exactly as John says, he would have been kind of gesturing in support, if not being deeply in support, later in his life, of communists.
John Evers, before we got started, you pointed out where Al Smith sat in this chamber as a member of the Assembly. He started out
And for 2 full years, he never spoke, which is hard to believe.
and then he sat in 2 seats that are right here where we've got 2 gentlemen. We've got a gentleman here with a beard raising his hand,
The majority leader.
and when he served as majority leader of the Assembly, and this gentleman over here in the tie. Yes, you.
Smith was minority leader. That was in 1911. Smith became majority leader when the Democrats took over. In 1912, they went to the minority. And then in 1913, he wound up being the speaker. So he sat
Speaker, and right behind us is the Speaker's chair. But right off the chamber, maybe 20 steps from where we're sitting, is the Speaker's office that Al Smith used, the current Speaker for City Sheldon Silver. I'm so sorry about that. Sheldon Silver, of course, uses that office now, and in there is a portrait of Al Smith.
They came from the same district. They're both Democrats. They both were Speaker of the Assembly. It's interesting that when you talk about, it's almost 100 years ago that Smith was Speaker, and 100 years later we have a Speaker from the same district, same political party. The neighborhood is still a very diverse neighborhood. Smith became Speaker on a fluke. New York State reapportionment was so heavily weighted in favor of the Republicans that the Democrats rarely held this chamber. Smith was here 12 years. He was only in the majority twice. And it was only became Democratic once in the 30s, and then he had to go all the way into the 60s before the Democrats took over. I think Smith would be most proud to see that the Democratic Party finally got the equal representation it needed when they changed the whole voting system in New York to match federal what they would vote. And you could then allow New York City to send its proper
I'm gonna go do that,
to
John.
New York, and as a result, we had Speaker.
We talked to the Speaker, Sheldon Silver, about Al Smith.
I think he was ahead of his time.
say,
His reaction to the trade shirtwaist fire, putting in legislation to deal with child labor, with labor generally, protecting workers, are things that we in the Assembly do today. Al Smith, when he was then the governor of the state, he talked about having a wealthier pay a little bit more. He had some great quotes about it. I actually wrote one down because it's as early today as it was in 1930. So what they say about our colleagues who reject an income tax amendment, what do they say? They reject it. Why? They're unwilling to say that raising wealth would to bear its share of the burden of government. They're unwilling to subscribe to the indisputable principle that he who benefits the most should pay the most. And that was Al Smith in 1930, and that debate is taking place today again.
Still trying to go do that
John
jump
Evers, that portrait
in
of
left field. I think this is almost over. It's a 2-hour video.
Was
It's
elected
at
to the Assembly
1.5
when he was only about 30 years old.
Oh, I'm in left
And so
field.
he would probably be in that picture,
Or
mid-30s or
close
so.
to,
He maybe close to
Albany,
35, 36 or so.
close
So
to
that might have been one of his official portraits as an assemblyman,
Oh,
and it might
come
very well
on.
been as a portrait as a speaker.
How powerful was the Speaker of the House, Speaker of the New York Assembly, and how does that compare with the power today?
Well, the speaker is always the most powerful person. I'd say it was comparable. Back then, when Smith was just starting out, and as I mentioned, he sat way in the back row, he didn't even
Mike
meet the
Speake was
speaker,
just a purple
Fred
back
Nixon, who was
then.
from Chautauqua County, until 3 days before the session adjourned. The speaker back then was almost regal. Today, it's the power's more diffuse. There's more chairman. It's not as arbitrary as it used to be. But still, the speaker has tremendous control over the bills that come to the floor, the chairman that are made chairman, who's on what committees, what the program will be. So it still is a key job. One of the 3 most
What
powerful
the
people in the state, the Senate leader,
clubhouse?
the Assembly leader, and the governor.
Beverly Gage, state politics in New York in the teens and today.
Well, as I said, New York is this key state nationally, but it has its own particular political culture, and I think in many ways reflects some of the same things we see today. The difference between your sort of urban core, your New York, at that time largely dominated, although not exclusively, by a Tammany machine, and upstate New York, you've got cultural differences, you've got political differences there, because you had all of these differences, it was always a question of what kinds of issues you were actually going to be able to deal with at the state level.
Wait.
One of the things things that
I didn't
Al
think
Smith ends
that
up doing as governor, as I understand it, John,
this
anyway,
one
is that
existed.
he tries to make it possible for the governor to do more than he's
This
been able
one
to do.
I thought
It's
was
not a
only in
particularly
single
strong
player.
post at that point. Certainly for Tammany Hall, your power is really concentrated in
That's
New York
the
City.
one,
And
if
so,
you look at her
Al Smith
face
is sort of
real
an
good,
ambassador from the city to the
that's
rest of
the
the state
only
in
woman
certain ways, but
in
he's also trying to
multiplayer
make it
that
possible
I've
for
ever
this kind
seen.
of
You're on the contenders.
If you look close at this one, that's the same one.
Commentary and then a question. Your forum is absolutely incredibly stimulating. I don't have the credentials that you folks do. So as far as concerned, despite his opposition to the New Deal and this and that,
So they all have that face.
into the picture, he was clearly a proponent of the middle class.
Just different like clothing styles. Even this one's gonna have the same face, different hair, different outfit.
Running for the presidency of the United States, one candidate with Mr. Smith's mindset, he able to pull it off. But despite that, thank you so much.
She's gone forever, I think.
Beverly Gage.
I think that's a really interesting question because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Smith goes through a very weird political transition in the 1930s. After he's lost the presidential election, he really does flip on a lot of what he's stood for up to that point. And I know that we're going to get to talking about that a little bit later in the
So
show.
here I
He
am,
was a
and when I
populist
say
of sorts.
I
He wasn't
mean
an
this-
absolute populist, and he certainly wasn't a William Jennings Bryan populist. If anything, he really
says
didn't
right
like
there
the
the
Bryan
name,
wing of the
the
party,
top right.
particularly around cultural issues.
I'm looking
but
to go
he
to
was
the
a
left
sort of
right here.
populist, and I think it's absolutely true that he's an advocate of the middle class. He himself is a figure who embodies and then advertises that he embodies the kind of working your way up through the American system from childhood of poverty up to success. And so the candidate today who had that kind of populist message, or at least pseudo-populist message, would it be successful? I think it's really hard to say. I mean, Smith was not particularly successful in his day, ultimately on the national stage, and I think populism has had a kind of mixed history in the United States.
At least there's people.
Is there a politician today that you can
What? Is there another Lost
I don't know.
Cornwall?
I was thinking about this.
That's the
in today's
motorcycle
race, he might be more of the
is in
technocrat,
Los
and I'll explain that because
Santos,
populism itself, that
Paracho
Smith,
means bull?
embodied, was
There's a
almost like a
picture of a
compassionate
bull
technocrat. He
right
wanted
there.
to do the New Deal prior to the New Deal.
That's a
In fact, he
bull?
experimented with a lot of these problems, smart sizing. Smith would probably lick his lips and say, "I'd love to go to D.C. and try to figure this out." That's what he did in Albany, and he did it in a Republican state with a Republican legislature. So even the discussions now with the bipartisan gridlock and everything, Smith had that in New York. So he would probably sell himself very well today by saying, "I've done this in New York. I've battled the
Those
legislature
ladies
that's
still
hostile.
there?
I know how to get government under control. I know how to get the economy back moving again." So I think he would be seen almost as a technocrat, not flashy, but probably some of that would be almost the brain
I
trust
think
kind
I'm
of guy.
completely mistaken on what I've been talking about for 5 minutes. That one,
James?
I was wondering if
there, that was just the regular one. The only one. There's only one female character face in all of the multiplayer. But in single player, there's lots of different ones. Tires are healing.
Thank you, James. Beverly Gage.
One would like to be able to say, yes, if Al Smith had been elected, none of the depression ever would have
You're going to do that
I don't
jump.
think that that's true. I don't think on economic issues by 1928, I mean, the 1920s turn out to be a relatively conservative decade on things like labor policy. Smith himself is not running an anti-Wall Street campaign in 1928.
Watch it! Watch it!
Candidate 4 years earlier, that was Bob Follett, actually running in 1924 on a progressive party platform. And that had a much more sort of anti-Wall Street
Apparently there's
sentiment.
only
It had
one
a much
exit.
more strict set of regulations and had a lot more
some
focus
reason,
on economic issues. So, unfortunately,
going
I
that
don't
way
think
is
that
not
this
even-
actually would have done a whole lot significantly different. And I'm not sure, to be honest, that any president was really in a position to foresee what was coming or really have the tools at that point to prevent it from happening.
I think that's kind of what worked at the end with his Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the ideas of going to experiment with government intervention in this. I heard somebody say, a historian say once, that if Smith had run and won in 1928 to stop this avalanche of financial ruin, let's take it back 10 years, 1918. Al Smith was elected governor. How? The accidental governor. It took Al Smith until maybe 1925 or 26 to get in the minds of the Republican Party in New York State that he wasn't going to lose. He runs in 1928 against Charles Whitman. 1918. Lost to history, but Charles Whitman, the DA of Manhattan, becomes governor of New York State, runs twice, gets elected, starts eyeing the White House in 1920. So maybe it would, history people, we don't do this for a living. We like to look back and say, what if? Maybe it wouldn't have been Harding. Maybe it would have been Charles Whitman if he had beat Smith. Well, Smith unseats this city governor largely because there's a flu epidemic. He campaigns around upstate New York. He turns out the New York City vote. He wins by a very slight margin. He gets in there. And in 1919 and 1920, the legislature just crosses its arms and says, we're not going to do any of these things. Republican legislature, Republican Assembly, the Republican Senate.
to the
But Smith starts the campaign right
dealership,
off by saying,
West
I'm going to have a
End,
Reconstruction Commission,
Motors.
capitalizing on the transition from
Oh,
wartime
you're gonna do the
economy to
jump
the
on
private
the
sector economy.
page.
He starts to put the strength. We're not going to do this pay-as-you go. We're going to bond so that we can have capital improvements spread out for many years instead of just having the infrastructure start to crumble. that will be the presidential year. Back then, New York governors ran at the same time that the presidents ran. The coattails were long. So sure enough, Smith gets reelected in 1920. Has very little to show. Or he loses in 22, and then in 24, and then in 26. So he starts to avalanche his success.
But at the same time, all of his elections for governor are pretty close.
They're close until the last two. He has a very, very close election, which is like 15,000 votes in 1918. He loses somewhat of a close election in 1920. The ticket, the National Democratic ticket in 1920, goes down in New York State by over 1 million votes. Smith only loses by 75,000. And that's where one famous person said to him, it was like swimming up Niagara Falls, and you came the closest that anybody ever did. He comes back in 1922 and wins a squeaker. And then in 1924, he starts to add to his totals, and he wins against Teddy Roosevelt Jr. and then Ogden Mills in 26. So he didn't have light opponents either. But it was only in the 1920s when his terms start to pay.
There's no copy machine?
In
Come on,
1920, he's seen as the accidental governor.
1920, women get the vote. Does that make a difference in Al Smith's electoral career?
Well, Al Smith is interesting because, as John indicated before, he actually staffs a lot of his inner circle with women at a moment when
I just
many figures are doing that.
smashed a window and drove in here, and these people didn't even react.
Francis Perkins, who becomes FDR's Secretary of Labor, is
I'm not complaining, just saying what's going on. And now they're like, wait, oh, he broke. Or one guy's like, what's going on?
On women in government. I mean, the advent of the women's vote doesn't immediately
Alright,
have
so
a huge
here
impact,
I go.
certainly on national politics.
Here is
ultimately,
jump this
it doesn't have the impact that many people are predicting. And in terms of New York State politics, John would know this better than I, that I don't have the perception that it really transforms his
Not at first. In fact, Smith
Come on!
women's suffrage, and he changed his mind. In fact, Smith's mother said, I'll never vote. There's no need for me to vote. And she does. She casts her first ballot, I believe, for her son for governor. But Smith's hook on women's suffrage is he gets Bill Moskowitz and a lot of these people involved. And he starts to realize these are new voters. And they say, well, how do I talk to these people? And they said, talk to them like you would talk to the Chamber of Commerce, like you would anybody else in a campaign. And Smith starts to realize that women's suffrage is a good idea. I can enlighten these people. I can get them to vote Democratic. And that's where he gets the brain trust of many of the people that work for him, for governor, for president, like Roosevelt, Bill Moskowitz, Francis Perkins, and a lot of these other reformers that become sturdy supporters of the Democratic Party. And Smith capitalizes on that.
So just a few blocks
Oh,
south
come
of
on.
Al Smith lived for 8 years.
Capitalizes on that.
So just a few blocks south of here is the New York governor's mansion. Al Smith lived there for 8 years or so.
Such a thing even possible?
The governor, from the Capitol, or from the governor's mansion, the Capitol, they stop him and say, do you go to school with my sons? Probably son Arthur said, oh yeah, I do. And the governor would joke with him and everything. He was very much, I was going to say, just a neighborhood guy. The mansion, of course, had 5 children. Its own zoo. And this is true, he had a zoo.
Oh,
this is
yeah.
No, he
Well,
put
here's
with him. He would
where they stopped developing
bear,
this game.
he had elk. At one point, somebody gave an
Because
alligator.
of the bridge.
He had all this
There's
stuff.
a
Smith always
tunnel.
loved animals.
Right
When he was a
here.
kid, he used to collect dogs. And down in the South Street, and on the
Is
Seaport,
the reason
people would
that
come in,
there's
sailors would come in and had these
no
exotic
ferry
animals.
to
And they
take
gave him
people back
monkeys
and
and
forth
goats,
because of
and he'd
this
take them
tunnel.
home and put them in his attic. And then he had him in his backyard. And
Developers,
he always said never less than 2 dogs, I think he used to say. In fact, when he came here for his first term, he brought with him
teamed
his
up with the
Great Dane, and the Great Dane jumped up on the
workers
truck,
of
and Smith joked that
it's
it's good
now
sense of humor. It's
shut
the Danny
down
Tiger
because
come
there's
to
no
take over.
business for
And that
the
was his
ferry.
love of animals. So the governor's mansion
Going
with 5
back and
children,
forth between
all these animals. It was always a hectic place, and he always had
Albany
the kids dropping in.
Island
It's kind of a very friendly,
That's,
family atmosphere.
across the river
debt
that
for his love of animals because one of the out of political life and one of the reasons that has Robert Moses is sort of refashioning New York's parks is that one of the reasons that he insists that there be a zoo in Central Park is so that Al Smith can go visit the animals who live in town by that point, and there are really some very poignant stories from the end of Smith's life about him. He literally had a key to the zoo, and he would go down there sometimes in the middle of the night. He would take his grandchildren down and he would just kind of hang out with the animals at the Central Park Zoo. But in many ways, the Central Park Zoo really is Robert Moses' tribute to Al Smith and his love of animals.
The honorary night superintendent was Smith at Central Park.
Well, we've had a very in just a minute. We're going to start taking questions
There's
from you
one
as well.
place in the
But
whole
we've got a
map
very
that has
patient
speed
Tony
bumps.
in Pleasantville, New York, who's been on the line holding.
in
Tony,
Middle Park.
you're on C-SPAN on the Contenders.
Okay, thank you. C-SPAN, I've watched it for 40 years. I think more people watch C-SPAN. We have better presidential candidates. But you beat me to the punch about Bill Moskowitz and Robert Moses. The two of you guys didn't speak for 2 years. 8th grade education, didn't speak in the assembly, intimidated by all of the other lawyers that were there. Can you tell us what Al Smith did at night while the others went down on State Street to booze it up and carouse? What was Al Smith doing and how did he educate himself?
Tony, we're going to get John Evers to answer those questions, but I know you're a New Yorker. Is that your reason for your interest in Al Smith and your knowledge?
Well, I read a great book called Empire Statesman. I didn't know much about Al Smith.
They're the
Worked in all these
Empire
files.
State.
I knew the Al Smith building was there, the tallest building in New York State before the Empire State Building, I believe. But I didn't know much about Al Smith until I read a book, a biography called Empire Statesman.
All right.
I had never heard of Al Smith before I'm watching this on C-SPAN. I didn't even know that they'd be talking so
Served
much
as his
about
unofficial gatekeeper. I think her job was the head of PR
think
was done
like
with the
one of
Reconstruction
those
Commission of Moscow, which is
American
brainchild.
flag-colored
She
popsicles.
recruited Bob Moses into the administration. In fact, Tammy Hall became very interesting.
That's
Point you
the
mentioned
Times
about him
Square
speaking at
disc.
the assembly. Smith sat so far back and was so intimidated, and he was so lost.
Then
that
the
he went
Central
back to
Park
New York after
disc,
his second term and told
and
Tom Foley, the Tammy Hall
speed
Assembly
bumps.
District, I think I might be in over my head. And he told him, I might be able to find you a job, maybe superintendent of buildings in New York City, if you really can't hack it. And that appealed to Smith's ability to fight, and he said, I'm not going to admit that I can't handle something. So he went back with a mission, and he took all the bills back every night and read them. He read every bill introduced.
It's almost like that
understand the
crazy
legislature because he didn't have a high school or college
at
degree.
where
He was a lawyer.
only
The assembly
speed
at the
bumps
time
in this
was
entire city
prominently the legal field. Smith made sure that he could do that. And also, since he didn't have any money, I mean, he lived on the $1,500 a year plus the traveling expenses. He had nothing else to do. He didn't go out partying at night. He didn't do bad things. He missed his family. He would go back to his room at his hotel and he'd read. And when he wasn't there, he'd be in the legislative library looking up the bills and the laws that they affected.
John Evers, are appropriations bills still about 300 pages long?
Yeah, they could save a lot of trees by having them done electronically. Smith was the chairman of Ways and Means, and in 1911, he used to read the appropriation bill cover to cover, and he said not more than 10 people in the Assembly or the Senate
Those
could
are
explain
only
the
seen in
appropriation
Los
bill.
Santos.
Thick stacks of appropriation
And I
line by
think
line by
this
line. He
parking
mastered
garage
that, and
was for
ultimately led him to
practice
become a very
driving
good
and
financial governor because
developing
he had
the
an understanding of the
driving
budget system.
mechanics.
Now, we have a question here from
And I
our
think it was
audience, and I
actually
want
a
to introduce this
football
question here.
because
This
the
is David
original
Church.
game
He's
engine of
author.
this
Did not
was
know he was going to be here tonight,
a
but we know him
mobile
from
phone
TV.
game
He wrote a book about the 1960 election,
of a
and he
football
just has a new
game,
book coming
and
out,
this is about
which
the size of
called
a football
1948,
field.
about the 1948
And they
election.
started the entire
Thank you, and your
GTA
guests are doing a
4
great
and
job
5
tonight.
right
There's
there.
a constant
That's just what I'm
in the
assuming.
Al Smith's career.
And this
There's Stanley
building right
Hall, there's
here is
Franklin
an
Roosevelt, there's
Epsilon
another fellow,
program
William
disc.
Randolph Hearst.
I
What
learned
can you
from
say
a
about that relationship,
Facebook group.
specifically the 1918
Someone
to
showed a
1922 gubernatorial
Epsilon
races in
program
1932?
particular building
sort of the
every
man
city
around which Smith
and make it
has deal with the press in many ways. Now, I know that you were
make
talking
it
earlier, you said you had been writing about this in great deal detail about
headquarters,
the
or
film
whatever,
issue
just the
and
New York or the
tax on
Liberty City.
Yeah, this is a great
Oh, and
question.
then there's
Because William Randolph Hearst was probably one
Sierra
of the most controversial
Maya
government figures or quasi-government figures in New
James
York history. He was a two-term
statue.
congressman from New York City. He basically bought the seats.
And this is a
He
real
wanted he
statue
tried to get the
in
nomination in 1904 for President of the United States.
England.
He lost that. He runs for
Might be in
governor in
Scotland,
1906 against Charles Evans Hughes and loses.
This
He
is
runs
the
for New York
basis
City
of
mayor
this
and loses.
it's a
But
disc.
he
It
has
says
control
Dr.
of the
Jeremiah
children's
James
papers,
right
the
there.
Evening Journal and the New York American, and he
And
turns
then
out
there's an actual statue of a
basis appeal to people and to try
or,
to tell
I don't
them
know,
that
there was
I know
something
better,
on
I'm a
the
reformer.
news,
I want municipal ownership utilities to lower your rates. I want
recently.
to have transparent government.
recently,
You can get that if you
I
back
mean
me.
like about 6 months
In
ago, they were
1918,
talking
he
about
wants the
taking out a
nomination for governor,
statue
and they try to figure out how to go about, who's going to get this. They settle on Smith.
and he
Smith
was
goes and gets elected. In 1919, immediately, William Randolph Hearst starts to poke at Smith's programs. There's a milk strike in New York City. The upstate dairies can't get the milk into New York City. They have a milk strike upstate where the producers won't ship it to New York City. Well, none of this is within the purview of the governor's powers. The governor tries to get his Department of Farms and Markets Act. They won't act because they don't report to the governor, which is because the governor has no power over his own departments. Hearst won't take this answer. And he also says you're moving too slow in municipal ownership. We want utilities in New York City to be owned. You're the governor. You should make the legislature do this. They won't do
I thought
this.
it was right here.
So Smith goes head to head with him. On October, I think, 29th of 1919, he takes the stage at Carnegie Hall and has it out with Hearst. He has a debate, invites Hearst to the debate. Hearst won't show up to the debate. He goes to San Simeon and starts buying more artwork. Smith goes, probably loses control, red in the face, screams and yells about this man, and unmasks Hearst. Hearst then ironically puts out back Smith for re-election. Smith wants nothing to do with it. He battles again in 1922. Smith is going to make a comeback for running for governor.
Oh, it's an
Hearst
Atlantic
wants nomination.
City.
Smith says, I want a ticket
Especially
with Hearst.
because
It's either me or Hearst. He said, well, Hearst will settle to be a U.S. Senator. He said,
Island
well, I'll
Albany.
ticket if he's going to be a U.S. Senator. He said, well, why don't you run for U.S. Senator, run for governor? Well, let a ticket with Hearst.
So this is Atlantic
Smith was one of those guys who was, he was honest. He just says, I'm not going to be somebody that would change my mind left and right and be as despicable as Hearst when it comes to character assassination.
I don't know if everybody knows
basically,
that
and then he also unseats the New York City mayor, who's
Dome
now
of the Rock
on Mayor
is.
Island, who was one of Hearst's allies, and replaces him with Jim Venetian from the FDR Smith battle. He takes his votes from California.
At the bottom right, it
in
says-
Texas for John Yancey Garner, and they give it to Roosevelt. Knocks Smith out. He loses his nomination because of Hearst's behind the scenes.
There might be some stuff.
Presidential elections, and Al Smith was active. 1920, 24, 28, 32. Here is a newsreel recap from 1932 about the 24, 28, and 1932 elections.
What else is over here? Here, a copy and paste of that parking lot that I showed. There's some pool like that. It's a really deep pool.
The Democratic Convention of Houston, the Lone Star State. And once more, Franklin D. Roosevelt took the stage to praise as only he could do the man for whom he has always had such affection and respect, naming him again the Happy Warrior, his friend, Alfred E. Smith, the governor of New York. Al Smith will always have his own place in the hearts of the American people. But events were moving fast. Al Smith, as candidate for president in
another
persuaded
helicopter
Franklin
really
Roosevelt
close
to
to
make the
here.
race. And although Mr. Smith lost the state by a narrow vote, Franklin Roosevelt was elected to his first term as governor. Already, Franklin D. Roosevelt was the favorite for the nomination. His leading opponent, by a strange travesty of fortune, was none other than his old friend Alfred E. Smith.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, having received more than 2/3 of all the delegates voting, I
These
proclaim him the nominee of the convention for president of the
mansions
United
are a
States.
lot nicer than the ones in Los
You have
Santos.
nominated me, and I know it. And I am here to thank you for the honor. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
And back live in the New York State Assembly chamber, Beverly Gage, how did we get from 1928, FDR calling Al Smith the happy warrior and supporting him, to 1932 presidential election?
Right. Well, 1928, they are allies, and they've been allies before that as well. I mean, both coming up through the same New York Democratic Party. And
I don't think I've ever
a
been
couple of
so
things
lost.
happened between 1928 and 1932, some of which are very personal and some of which are on a grand scale. The most important thing that happens between 1928 and 1932 is, of course, that we enter the Depression.
I think it's like
so
way
Herbert Hoover
up
begins in
there that I'm
1929
looking
as
to go.
president. You get the stock market crash that year, and then by 1932, you're really in the deepest, darkest moment of the Depression. So that's bad news, but for the Democratic nominee for president, that's actually really good news. So in 1932, Al Smith wants to be the candidate again. In fact, he's put forth as a possibility, but there's a lot of controversy about whether or not this is going to be a good idea. There are a lot of people who do not want to introduce into what looks like it's going to be a smashing Democratic year all of the issues that you had seen in 1928. Issues about Catholicism, issues about prejudice, issues about prohibition, all of these sorts of things. Now, Franklin Roosevelt has a little bit to say about these things, but when he's a candidate in 1932, he's kind of being as even keel about all of this as you possibly can be. And so Smith is gunning for this, and there's a lot of pushback about that. And it's not clear either that Smith is a huge fan of Roosevelt. So they've had a very, very cooperative relationship, but it's always been Smith, the elder statesman, with Roosevelt, the supportive younger man. And
I think I'm going to do the
seems
jump
that at this
instead of
moment,
getting
Smith,
that
in fact, we should acknowledge, like a lot of people in the United States in 1932, he views Franklin Roosevelt kind of as a dilettante, as someone who's not willing to come out and take who wins that in the end in 1932. And it doesn't take very long for Smith to begin to attack Roosevelt personally as well as politically. And I think that it's
There's my
easier to
stack
understand
auto.
his
I don't know if
personal
there's gonna still
animosity
be,
toward Roosevelt as it begins to develop.
there are.
I've always found it a little bit more puzzling to understand how by 1936 he's actually endorsing the Republican presidential candidate and is embracing a kind of politics that he really hadn't embraced before. Is it because he's heartbroken? Is it because he doesn't like Roosevelt? Is it because he's actually changed his mind as he sees Roosevelt
Still
actually
no
act?
copy
The
machine,
elections are
but
all
one
still kind of open
Mr.
questions about their relationship.
Einstein
And now
in
back to
here.
your calls here on the Contenders.
There's no
Sharon,
copy
Arkansas,
machine. Nobody
Richard,
else in
you're
here.
on
Just
C-SPAN. Please
Mr.
go ahead with the
Einstein
question or comment
sitting
for our two guests.
on nothing.
My grandfather, Albert
Mr.
Godfrey
Einstein is in here.
Haynes for president.
Take it easy,
Well, let's
Mr.
ask the former New
Einstein.
York State Assembly historian if he can do
He
that.
has a beard.
Will be one of the subjects of the future Contenders, I think, in 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, there really is no comparison. With Dewey, the personalities couldn't be more different. They really couldn't be. First of all, Smith is a Democrat, Dewey's a Republican. Smith is a progressive, pre-New Deal
Upside down?
Dewey
Upside
takes over
down.
the reins in New York State after Herbert meets Herbert Lehman, who was the handpicked successor of FDR and Al Smith, and he runs New York State during the New Deal. And he is, by all accounts, somebody that implements his
what?
program. So he's not a rock Republican in the sense of a conservative, kind of like a Nelson Rockefeller Republican. Dewey wanted to be president, made it known. I think there was rumors that he was going to run for president, was a possible presidential candidate when he was still, I think, New York District Attorney. He had in the cards that he wanted to do this for a long time. Smith's campaign in 1928 had always been troubled from the start. He did get the nomination, and he did his whirlwind campaign from July onwards. Dewey had more of the modern campaign that he got. In fact, FDR did this in 1932. He knew he'd run early on and travel the country lining up delegates, getting his campaign in order. So I think the biggest differences between Dewey and Al Smith were probably that Dewey was out there with this campaign and this preparation a lot more than Al Smith ever was.
We have a question here in our audience. If you would, if you feel comfortable, tell us who you are, where you're from.
Thank you. My name is Amy Standart. I'm from Clifton Park, New York. And my question is, besides the zoo that Al Smith brought to the governor's mansion, what was his most notable achievement for New York and or the country?
As governor.
As governor, as candidate for president, what was his most notable achievement?
Well, I think
That's
that
the parking garage, but where's
if I
the
were to rattle
auto
them off, it
dealer?
would be kind of impressive, but we don't have like 3 hours. Probably Smith's biggest achievements were to bring progressivism into the modern age. Smith was that Green New
try
Deal
that
type
again.
person. FDR certainly had his own programs, but Smith had the modern labor code, he had parks and recreation, he had New York State vote on bonds, hundreds of millions of dollars of bonds to improve
Now just
roads
one
and bridges,
person in
railroad
here
crossings,
again?
parks, hospitals, prisons.
It's
He
a
was ahead of his
lady?
time when it came to criminal justice. Smith's
other
whole
people
movement
in
of
here.
government was not to downsize government, but to use government as a tool to provide people with services. Instead of it used to be more of a conservative where government was simply there. The federal government would deliver the mail. It had the military. In New York State, it really wasn't that much different. It did certain functions, but it didn't go out there and regulate industry. It didn't go out there and regulate utilities. It didn't provide parks and recreation. It didn't have the interaction with people that really needed it. So I think if Smith's overall accomplishments in New York State was to launch us on a social welfare in the best positive senses of the word.
John Evers, when you're here in the New York State Capitol, beautiful old building finished in 1894, here in Albany, surrounded...
Albany. That sounds just like Albany. On the map is what it says. It should say Albany. It'll say Alderney City.
I think that it would be okay with the state government as it is. Smith was governor, was 10.5 million people. He realized that the state government needed to be housed. In fact, he was one of the people that said you've got to get these agencies not only coordinated, but he used to joke and say we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every year on renting little offices. Can't we build state office buildings? Can't we...
I just wanted to add on the national stage, I think he really plays a very different but equally important role in the sense that Smith's candidacy in 1928 comes after a decade where sort of said already issues about immigration, issues about racial targeting people from places like Italy, like Russia.
Hard to land, especially at night.
That decade was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was a mass organization.
Watch it! Watch it!
I'm gonna put on In the Evening Led Zeppelin. In the Evening Led Zeppelin covered. I would say that'd be one of the best bands that would female sing a cover song. Come on. That is not very loud. Yeah, there we go. She looked like she had a different face than the one. Did my PlayStation just freeze though? It did. And she does have a different face. That's the end of the stream. PlayStation's frozen. Frozen at the Grand Northumbrian Hotel. That's the end of the stream, I suppose.